So Haiti is very salient, it's still happening, and you're still involved in that response. Tell us about what's happening there, what are the challenges, and some of the things that are working and not working so well.
Well, in my personal experience, given that I've been in 7 of the 10 major earthquakes in the last 10 years that occur in the world where my agency responded, I think this one is by far the worst. I think it also will exceed the tsunami in terms of number of victims, number of injured people, and just the scene that I saw on my arrival to Port-au-Prince, walking into the hospital and seeing roughly 400 to 450 bodies laying all over the hospital, just like somebody guessed the people. That's more than a half of the declared victims in the Chile earthquake, which, by the way, my agency is also responding, and the team is already on the ground, and we're sending medical supplies. But in terms of logistics, we were quite lucky with Haiti response. This is the first time that we actually managed to respond to the emergency within 24 hours time frame, which was our ideal goal. Our team landed on the ground 23 hours after the earthquake. We sent a team from Washington, D.C. Via Miami to Santo Domingo, and they were lucky to get on one of the planes that was bringing medevac patients out and then flew into the Port-au-Prince. I joined them a day later, and quick establishment of the logistics cluster is what helped International Medical Corps and many other agencies to respond quicker and more efficient.
And the Haiti earthquake is different from traditional events in the sense that it takes place in a urban area with lots of population concentration. Can you tell about the challenges that earthquake?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few words about logistic challenges. When we arrived, the initial assessment of infrastructure have shown that the port has a very limited capacity, that actually only the ships that have all handling equipment will be able to dock there. There was an issue of proper warehousing space. There was also an issue of number of the slots at the airport, because airport is fairly small and can take maximum up to 150 flights. But in early days, what really did hamper that is there was no proper handling equipment on the ground, so planes were taking spots for much longer than they actually should have. And arrival of logistics cluster and assistance of the U.S. military helped to maximize the capacity of the airport. Also, what I want to stress out is that visits of some VIPs, such Sarkozy, Ms. Clinton, didn't help out, because it would shut down the airport and the whole airspace. So us who had medical teams flying, on the helicopters, that didn't even have to go to the airport, we were shut down with our operation, and we couldn't receive cargo planes during that time. Some of our cargo planes got diverted to Santo Domingo. So it will be very important for our VIPs to understand how their moral support sometimes actually hamper the humanitarian intervention. In addition to these logistical challenges, it was very early determined that the only way to move commodities efficiently into the country, if you can get the slot at the Port-au-Prince airport, is to move cargo to Santo Domingo, and then from Santo Domingo by road over to Haiti. And that's where logistics cluster played a crucial role to enable the agencies who didn't have a registration in Haiti. For example, International Medical Corps intervened to Haiti for the first time, and we only were able to get a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Health, because the government bodies that were responsible for registration of the agencies were non-functional. So as such, we were not eligible consignee in country, and if there was no help of the logistics cluster, we wouldn't be able to move our commodities in. We were lucky to get enough supplies and enough human resources to do our intervention for a week. But without support of the logistics cluster, any onwards resupply and even movement of the human resources would not be possible. They moved for us over 200 of our volunteers that were working in Port-au-Prince Hospital. International Medical Corps took a lead role in coordinating activities in that hospital, and at any given time we had 50 physicians and nurses working there. So basically, United Nations Humanitarian Air Service have saved us a lots of time of work for these people, because each time they would fly somebody, they would save us a day that people would normally lose driving from Santo Domingo into Haiti, and the same on the way out. So you count 200 people, that's 400 days of work, and 400 days of work in a disaster where every minute means that you can save somebody's life or more lives is quite important.
Yeah, I mean, the role of the cluster has been dramatic, and that has been a recent development in the United Nations. Can you tell a little bit about the role of the United Nations cluster, how it came to be?
Well, after tsunami in Indonesia, where coordination, as most of the people will say, was not very efficient, I think at that time what was more efficient was actually bilateral collaboration. And coordination meetings were just a forum where people could meet each other, but they were not efficient in terms of identifying gaps and addressing the gaps of the humanitarian intervention. So it was obvious that coordination has to improve, and as a result the cluster concept was created, and for the first time was deployed in Pakistan, where International Medical Corps also intervened. And at that time we made an organizational decision that IMC will mandatory participate in all cluster coordination for the sectors that are relevant to our type of operation, mainly health, water and sanitation, nutrition, and where appropriate some other sectors, but logistics as well. And since Pakistan, this cluster concept started evolving, cluster leads recognize the need to train the people who manage the cluster coordination, because sometimes you can have a brilliant logistician who can effectively move thousands of tons of the goods very fast, but they are not good coordinators. So among those good logisticians, the sector had to select those who are prominent leaders who can manage effectively the meetings and get the best out of them. And I think we're on a good track, because people, and I can speak of logistics cluster in Haiti, people who led the cluster in the first 2 months were absolutely brilliant.
It's wonderful to hear the impact, the positive impact from the United Nations cluster approach. Yet there are still issues of coordination on the ground, which is a commonplace, very difficult challenge to overcome. Could you tell us a little bit about those coordination issues that remain?
Well, I believe that it's much easier to do the coordination in service-oriented clusters, such as logistics cluster and ITC cluster. It's far more difficult to run effective coordination in a program-related clusters such as health, nutrition, water and sanitation, education, etc. Because there's so many unpredictable things that happen every day. In logistics cluster, things are more streamlined. We have to define the right access routes, and we have to do our best to utilize and maximize those access routes, prepare sufficient transport means and warehousing means, and then organize support to the distribution. While for the program, every day they're discovering new gaps, and they have to work out on maximizing all the resources that are present in the country of intervention, and most of the time the resources that are on the ground are not sufficient to cover all the gaps. So people have to look and coordinate their pipelines of human resources and material resources to be able to effectively respond. So for the programmatic cluster, it's far more difficult to do it. However, as more and more agencies are becoming committed to the coordination is becoming better. I'm a general optimist, so I always see the things from the bright side. But yes, there are definitely lots of problems. However, if we join together and work to address those problems, I think as the time goes by, coordination will be more and more effective. One of the problems for the cluster is also the burnout of the staff and their quick rotations, and sometimes these rotations are causing some slight gaps because people are unable to pick up quickly on what their predecessors did, and kind of flawlessly maintain the institutional knowledge. But what I've seen in this emergency is that you could walk to the UN OCHA tent, maybe it's now a container, 2 months after the emergency, and you could plug your USB stick into the computer and download all the maps of the areas, who does what where, all the assessment data, etc. for different clusters. And I think that kind of information sharing became very important. In the past it was mainly web-based, and people had a basic issue of access to internet to be able to get to the data. But now all the data is being consolidated on the ground in one place, and all you have to do is to get there with USB stick that is not preloaded with viruses, and get your data and then use that data effectively.
So there are two streams of topics that we talked about, you talked about, that are very interesting, and I'd like to pursue them in separate. So first one, you talked about gaps, right? So in programmatic clusters, there is the recognition of different gaps taking place at different times, and that might actually impair or change the priorities of gaps that get assessed. Now there is a limit in terms of the resources available as well as the demand, and that is a logistic issue as well. So we are facing something like this in Haiti right now, right? We have limited capacity via ports and via the airport, and so a lot of the materials coming in, the majority, I would say, coming through Santo Domingo. What is the outlook in terms of addressing these gaps, and how should we deal with our expectations for solving them?
Well, the cluster system is pretty efficient at this, because they look at the gaps, but they also look at what are the priorities among those gaps that are identified. And then between different clusters, they're putting the priorities up front on the list. So now the clusters define what type of commodity becomes a priority for transport into the country or for distribution. They also identify, based on the resources available, who could potentially address the gap, and then they pose a request to the specific organization that may have that capacity to intervene. Of course, clusters are not dictating who's going to do what where, but they can pretty much streamline the intervention. And I think that's what is helpful. You earlier asked me about a particular emergency in Haiti because it mainly hit the urban area. Mm-hmm. And it's very unfortunate, but I think that's the main reason why this intervention will take a long time, and it may take years before any changes are actually made. Because when the emergency hits rural areas, all you have to do is to help people to, get by the first harvest, and in this case, you have impact on the people who are living in a tight, really packed urban area and have no possibility for a livelihood. They absolutely have no jobs, because those few who had the jobs lost their jobs because their businesses collapsed. And someone said, well, there's lots of aid agencies out there. We have about 900 plus registered agencies. If they on average employ 100 people, that's about 10,000 people maximum. We're talking of a city that has 2 million population, and that's lots of jobs that needs to be provided. Most of the governmental agencies are non-functional because the buildings have collapsed. There is a lack of the leadership on the side of the government, because government was equally affected as a population. And in this kind of situation, without possibility to provide a livelihood so that people could at least go and buy the food, I'm afraid we're going to have to feed the population for a long time before we establish some ways for them to get their livelihood. And right now, I have no idea how to do it.
This seems clear that it's a catastrophic event that will require years, if not decades, to be addressed. How do the organizations typically deal with this transition from response, humanitarian response, and development, long-term development?
Well, if we look at International Medical Corps, we have a clear vision of what we would like to do. For us, it's much easier because we are not addressing the livelihoods through our intervention, because we're mainly doing intervention in the sector of health and water and sanitation. So we're going to focus on the hospital, main hospital in Haiti, which is University and General Hospital, to help administration to effectively manage that hospital, to make sure that these services that are right now provided in the hospital can be sustained for a longer period of time. And we will also try to focus on the population on outside of the town that we are currently addressing through 16 mobile clinics, to make sure that those clinics are rehabbed up to standard so they can sustain the earthquake, and that they can continue providing the services once when IMC withdraws the support. But this is just a drop in the overall needs. We're feeding 250 orphanages, and we have to find a modality how these 250 orphanages will continuously receive the food. And again, we are just doing the drop in the sea of overall needs, but given that the sector of intervention is not addressing the livelihood, it makes it easier for us to sustain our intervention than it will be for the agency that will be addressing the shelter and the livelihood in particular.
What are some of the metrics to evaluate how well it did its mandate, it did its job?
Well, International Medical Corps has a very strong monitoring and evaluation unit, and each of our proposals to our donors includes clear indicators that are measuring short-term and long-term success of our intervention, and making sure that we do all the data tracking on a regular basis is going to be very helpful to do the midterm evaluation of our programs, make an adjustment as necessary together with the people who are supporting financially our programs, and hopefully that will get us to the point that we're going to reach all our set targets. And this is how we function everywhere else in the world. But then when it comes to the logistics, my small team is barely coping with the daily work. We are working extended hours, and we're getting lots of support from the management. But at this point, we have no capacity to do our own metrics. So I cannot say, we had the metrics and we measured how well we intervened in Haiti. I can just say that we got extremely lucky with the flights, with the backup from our suppliers, with the backup from the United Nations agencies and our gifting kind partners in the US and Europe, who provided commodities timely, and that we were lucky to select the right type of the items that we immediately brought with us to bridge that gap in the first week until we arranged a resupply. And it was nothing else but a pure luck.
It's very modest of you to say that. I'm sure that luck was part of the equation. I'm also sure that competence was the other piece. I was curious, in terms of process, how is a day in Haiti from the time that you wake up, in your role providing relief in that environment? Could you walk us through what a day looks like in this environment for you? My day was mainly focused on going to the airport and making sure that our cargo flights are taken care of, that the cargo is received, counted, transferred to the warehouse, and then properly cataloged so that our program staff know exactly what we have there at any given time. The reason why I had to spend so much time at the airport is that our national staff could not get their access to the airport. So as an international, I was a bit more lucky, to be able to get there and be present each time when the cargo flight would arrive and we had to receive the cargo. And then as the cargo starts coming through the border, lots of time was spent commuting between Port-au-Prince and the border, making sure that all our cargo goes intact through the border and arrives safely to the warehouse, because safety was one of the major issues. There were instances where trucks of the other organizations or commercial trucks were taken in some side streets and robbed completely. So we had a situation of having drivers from Santo Domingo, who are Spanish speakers, coming into the country not having quite a good idea of where they're supposed to go. If they ask wrong person a question, they end up in the wrong street and they lose their cargo.
We had an instance when the World Food Program truck ended up in front of our warehouse, which is a dead-end street right next to the U.S. Embassy, and regardless of presence of U.S. security forces just a block away, people chased the truck down the street, slashed the tires, and start taking the cargo out. And these were not the criminals. They were just a bunch of desperate people who saw their children, being hungry for days without any kind of food, and they just took a box each and took off in their own direction. We managed to pull our guards out, to push the crowd back, and pull that World Food Program truck into the safety. So this is what alerted me that I have to go to the border every day and meet every single truck and make sure that they're actually coming to the warehouse. Once when we expanded our human resource base, it was much easier, because International Medical Corps is an organization that intervened to Haiti for the first time, and in the first few days we had to rely on the team that we got together. Later, it was easier. We got lots of capable national staff who was able to pick up on some of these roles, and then it became much easier. At those early days, we were participating in logistics cluster coordination daily to make sure that all the needs are addressed. Lots of time was spent trying to chase fuel around the town until we started our own supply of fuel from Santo Domingo. And then a couple of weeks down the road, fuel situation improved, commercial fuel became available, and it was possible to sustain daily operations without too much stress. But in early days, you had a car available, you expected to show up next morning to transport doctors to their workplace in a hospital, and the car doesn't show up because the driver was unable to get the fuel. So we were literally switching vehicles like a socks in the first days. But then later, as situation stabilized, as local markets started to be established, it was much easier.
So industry and academia are trying to do more, get more involved in humanitarian aspects, and in particular, I've seen a number of attempts to do more in the Haiti response. In your perspective, in your opinion, what could we be doing better or differently?
There is lots of lessons learned, or how somebody said the other day, lessons identified, which have to be captured, and we have to make sure that those gaps that we had and we could probably address better if we were thinking a bit more about them, or if we prepared a little bit better, that they don't happen again. And I think academia has a particular role in helping us analyze the effectiveness of our response and what went wrong, so that next time we can be prepared to do some of these things better, or at least to minimize the risks that come out of the gaps that we identified and didn't address at the time.
If you could give a message to people in the humanitarian sector, NGOs, the UN, the cluster, industry, academia, what would that message be, and who would be given to?
Seeing the effectiveness of the logistics cluster to the agencies like mine, that they don't have sufficient internal capacity to respond effectively, I would recommend to donors to continue funding logistics cluster. I would recommend all the agencies to use logistics cluster services, because if we individually go and source our transport means, whether they're air transport or whether they're road transport or sea transport, logistics cluster is able to negotiate much better rates with the commercial companies, and they're able to save a quite substantial amount of money compared to that money being sitting somewhere in the NGO budgets and them trying to do that support on their own. So we're talking of transport services, whether they're air transport, sea transport, road transport. We're talking of air transport. There is a substantial amount of money being saved by this approach, and a substantial amount of time and human resources deployment in particular that logistics cluster is saving. I see great benefit out of it. I see from emergency to emergency that they're improving tremendously, and this is definitely an initiative that is worth full support.